Hi everyone, welcome back to the Watch Insider. My name is Brian and thank you all for logging on. I'm joined tonight by Tim Mosso of Tim Mosso fame. And tonight we will be exploring the world of vintage watches, something that we do not talk about regularly on the show, but something that I felt was, time to do a little bit of a special on.
Absolutely. We've got a great selection, everything from dress watches to sports watches, all big brands too, and impressive pieces. Cross-section of chronographs, divers, dressers, and even a reverso. So let's roll out.
Yeah. So, we at Govberg and Watchbox, I think, as you would probably agree, have always specialized in modern era pre-owned. These are watches, I would say, from the 80s to 90s and onward, very much your typical pieces. And, I'd say we haven't stayed away from vintage, but it was never really our true forte, where it wasn't our only specialty. But over a while, we've actually been slowly amassing a large collection of pieces, some of which we've posted to our website, but it's something that we're going to be diving into in a much bigger way moving forward.
I would say out of our inventory at the moment of 1,700 watches, perhaps...
that are posted.
Yes, exactly. Perhaps 2 to 3% are vintage timepieces, as I would define it, 20 years or older. That represents a significant break from what's offered today. In general, you see a 20-year-old watch, it starts to look and feel distinctly different from current production. But I think we should just jump straight back to the beginning of time. Let's talk about the Patek Philippe 96.
Sure. So the Patek Philippe 96, one of the interesting facts about the watch that maybe you guys aren't all aware of is that this was the first Patek Philippe watch to have a reference number. And what's so special about this watch is that in 1931, when the Stern family, took over Patek Philippe, one of their first big initiatives was they wanted to create a production line watch that, not production line in the sense that machines are putting this watch together, but, a watch that could be produced in greater quantities than had ever been produced at the brand before, and something that they could sell on a worldwide stage. And, lo and behold, the reference 96 came out, and, what a beautiful watch it was at the time. Simple, elegant, most traditionally seen in yellow gold, but every so often we see I would say a stainless steel 96, which gets the auction world a buzz.
It's true, and this particular reference was in production for over 30 years, so the Stern brothers hit it right out of the park on their first swing. Important to note, a couple of things that make this watch important, not just one of the first Patek Philippe watches set up for serialized production in the modern sense, also the first Patek Philippe in many ways to be called the Calatrava by the embryonic Patek Philippe wristwatch vintage movement during the early 1980s. Vintage watches in the modern era really started with Patek, first pocket watches, and then later wristwatches. And in the early 80s, the term Calatrava, a reference to the company's logo, began to be applied to a series of watches constructed beginning with the reference 96 in 1932. So this watch is more than just the root of Stern ownership and the gateway to modern Patek from the vintage era, and I mean the true era of antiquity before the Sterns. But this watch in many ways is also the forefather of everything we describe as a Calatrava today. Significantly, it was a work of Bauhaus design, as it was form following function, the blended lugs being characteristic of some of the more sober and straight-laced timepieces developed during the era. Of course, the IWC Portuguese was a giant version of this watch constructed 7 years later. This was the inspiration for much of the dress watch design that came afterwards. Very simple and yet timeless. If it weren't for the fact that this watch is 31 millimeters in diameter, it would look very much like a modern reference 5196.
Yeah, so, fabulous watch, and you can actually still find these at, quite a compelling price point. They're not I would say overtly rare. In some executions they are, such as stainless steel or track dials or so on and so forth. But this particular example, I think that is a great watch, and it's it's not going to break the bank.
I would also say an interesting fact, when Patek Philippe went into bankruptcy receivership during the early 30s, the administrator of Patek during the bankruptcy was actually a member of the Lecoultre family, Jacques David Lecoultre, who was the last of the Lecoultre family to control Lecoultre, later JLC, and he actually put in a bid for the company. He was outbid by Patek Philippe's dial supplier, Stern Frere, which became the ownership that continues to this day. But Lecoultre was very close to actually owning Patek Philippe outright. And the relationship stayed close to the point that the reference 106 under the Stern brothers was actually a Reverso built under license by Patek. There are 4 pieces. Good luck finding one, guys.
But guys, thank you for joining in. We've got Matt Forster. We've got JBO Surf, a lot of our regulars, Eddie Landsberg. Thank you guys all for logging in. Why don't we sort of continue down the line? We will start with, of course, a Tim Mosso favorite. Here we have a Jlc Riverser from I'd call it 1935 to 1945. This is a Jaeger-Lecoultre Reverser that was made for a retailer, Favre Labre, at the time, which actually is now, it's a watch brand now, isn't it?
Yeah, Favre Labre today is actually owned by Tata of India, the fine people who own Jaguar and Land Rover. One large conglomerate. They've just been recapitalized. They are a watch brand again in their own right. Back then, they were also a retail arm that had this watch, Jaeger-Lecoultre co-branded. As you can see, both signs on the recessed center part of the dial. It's beautifully aged. This is one of the rare cases where I'll say patina is not just damage degrading the watch. It does give it character without compromising any of the original printing or appliques. I actually like the way this one's aged. It's got a sort of parchment effect to it.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it almost looks like it's a paper dial, but it's not. And, I tend to agree with you. I think that this is one of those times where, I'm extraordinarily happy that the dial wasn't cleaned off or changed or modified in any way. What you're looking at is the original iteration of the watch and just how it can age over time. On the back there, you've got engraving. I can't say if that's from the original owner or sometime in the future and after that, but it says, BB on the back. This particular watch, I think, is great if you're looking to pick up, a vintage Reverso. Did you already mention about the stainless steel?
Yes, it's first generation Stay Bright stainless steel, the kind that was originally designed for kitchen utensils, and you can see right on the back, Stay Bright, Acier Stay Bright, so steel Stay Bright. This was a major innovation in the watch industry starting in the 1920s. Through several iterations, Stay Bright helped to introduce stainless steel to watchmaking. Previously, if you weren't going to buy gold, oftentimes silver was used, and steel really helped to usher the end of silver-cased watches. So this was historically important on a couple of levels. Caliber 411 in this one. It's a manual wind center-second JLC-shaped caliber. The original Reversos said only Reverso on the dial because, frankly, Lecoultre had very little to do with them other than subcontracting them. Wenger made the cases, and Tavares actually made the movement, as Lecoultre didn't have a shaped caliber for the case back in 1931. By 1935, when this center-second caliber bowed, you finally had in-house caliber Lecoultre movements in the Reversos, and thus they were signed. Jaeger-Lecoultre, as at that point a company called Specialty Horlogerie had been established between Jaeger and Lecoultre to distribute the Reverso, and that company actually became the modern Jaeger-Lecoultre with the dual branding subsequently. So I believe this watch was made between 1935, when the movement became available, and roughly 1945, when Reverso production largely ceased for a generation. It was simply too pre-war for tastes of the post-war era.
And, we went back and forth a little bit. Definitely, this is the kind of watch where I would probably move this over to a strap. I think it would be much better suited to, a cool strap to, to fit the watch and give it a better look than that bracelet. I don't even know what that bracelet is.
Yeah, it comes with the watch. I'll say that. Here you can see the relative size of the original Reverso case and what's known as the Grand Taille case. Grand Taille is 42 millimeters lug to lug. The original, which in the modern era might be called Reverso Classique in recent years, this is 38 millimeters lug to lug. So the Grand Taille, which came about in 1991 for the 60th anniversary Reverso, it seems almost petite today, but back in 1991, when this was still the standard Reverso size, this seemed really big, which is why it's considered the big Reverso of the 90s, and this, the original Reverso, looks very much of a different era, despite the fact that the aspect ratio of roughly 1.618 is almost identical across the two. So it's got that golden ratio mathematical appeal on both.
Yeah. Moving right along, should we do a Rolex?
Let's jump to the 50s.
Let's jump to the 50s.
Okay.
Go for it. So here we have a Rolex reference 5508 Submariner small crown. And what differentiates this watch from, the Mill Sub and Comex and, let's call it the Submariner in general.
Well, here's the thing. This came a lot earlier than almost all of the 60s and 70s mill subs and Comexes. So this is the 5508, a reference made from roughly 1957 to 1961. It is the original no crown guard, bidirectional rotating bezel, 100-meter Rolex Submariner. Now, after the 6200, there were some changes to the dial, the arrival of Mercedes hands. You can see this one is gilt style. And the reason that oftentimes the depth rating was in silver was because the rest of the dial was standardized across the big crowns, which were 200-meter rated, and the small crowns, like the 5508, which are 100 meters rated. And so you'd have that silver stamp to distinguish which watch the dial ultimately went into, even though the dials were serialized exactly the same, save that one stamp. Now the watch is 37 millimeters in diameter because these early no crown guard subs were a little bit smaller. Even as late as the 1680, which ran into the early 1980s, that was the first sub with a date, they were still 39.5. The sub didn't attain its full 40 millimeter current figure until roughly the early 1980s and the late 1970s with the arrival of first the 16800 and later the 168000, the first of the modern subs. Now you can see this watch is exceptionally clean, and the most important thing to me is that the dial is sharp, and aside from being reloomed, it looks mostly original. I'll also say that one thing you can never restore is the volume of the case. These things tend to turn into the equivalent of a pebble in a brook as you lose all of the volume as well as the symmetry of the lugs from side to side. This one has a high 400,000 serial number, and they were built in a relatively narrow range. The small crowns like the 6536 and the 5508 were always considered to be utilitarian pieces, often used hard and put away wet, as they were effectively tools back in their day. Upscale sports watches, but still very much professional articles. And dive watches didn't become a mainstream article for office use until the 1970s and ultimately the 1980s. So the survival rate on these early subs, considering how they were treated in general, is exceptionally low. It's always a rarity to see a 37 millimeter steel sub in the modern day in this kind of condition.
Yeah, and what I was saying is, unlike the big crowns, Comex, and mill subs, you know, what sort of distinguishes this watch is that it really hasn't been a part of the major Rolex frenzy. I think that the 5508 has sort of flown under the radar. It definitely has appreciated in value over time, you know, in that all boats rise with a rising tide. But I still think that there's considerable value in these watches given what comparable models from the era are currently bringing at auction and what you can purchase these watches for.
It's true. This one has not gone crazy just yet. Personally, I think that a small crown, big crown, it's all the same now. No one's taking these watches in the water. You buy a sub from this era for period character. The end. And you buy on the basis of dial originality and condition and case volume and definition. So you really go on the basis of condition more than anything else with Rolex. And this watch has it all. It looks good. It's instantly recognizable as what it is. Because even though, and I can show you a early 70s 1680, I mentioned the first sub with the date. We're going to talk about red subs in a moment. But you can see how these are obviously two versions of the same watch. The calling card of the sub, like the Daytona, is that across generations, it's always been recognizable as part of the same family. It's not like Omega's Seamaster family, where you have a million different models, sub-model lines, 120s, 300s, professionals, Aquaterras, Planet Oceans. The sub is a sub is a sub, and therefore you always know one when you see it, regardless of detail changes over time. And that's really at the heart of Rolex's appeal, not just for the sub, but across all model lines.
And that's what sort of has, you know, I would say is probably most intriguing to me about vintage watches is just how you can have the same watch from the same era and put them in two different parts of the world and they live two different completely lives and the watches change in two completely different ways. And, you know, you see one example that's ironically serviced regularly, done everything that the brands would want you to do over the course of its lifetime, and you have service hands and service dial and a new bracelet and everything and so on and so forth. And somebody who just left the watch in a drawer to sit is the real winner in the end.
My grandma had a junk drawer back in Levittown when I used to visit Grandma's house. It was the coolest thing imaginable. I bet looking back, there must have been $500,000 worth of vintage dive watches in that junk drawer. Regrets. Regrets. So, speaking of vintage dive watches, we may as well continue in progression since our watches pretty much come in sequence one after the other. Let's jump to the red sub.
Awesome.
Okay, so now you can see the changes that were wrought. Not a huge time gap separating this watch from the 5508 we just saw. The 5508 roughly 1958, 59 with the serial number we just saw. This one has a serial number in the 2.8 million range, so this is roughly early 1972. 15 years, but a world of changes. In 1959, we got the 5512, which brought us the first Submariner with crown guards. And in roughly 1965, early 66, we got the 1680, which gave us crown guards and a date. Now we begin to see a sub that looks very much like what we identify as a sub in the year 2018. It's bigger, it's 39.5 millimeters, it's got crown guards, it's got a date, and it also has that all-important red sub dial. So there are generations of these things, and by about serial number 4 million in the mid-70s, the party was over. But this is what's known as a Generation 4 red sub. So the red subs are always the 1680.
And there were 7 variations for those that care.
Yeah, there's also a service dial. For the most part, we're going to talk about the 4 right here and what makes a 4. So you've got feet first. This was the first of the feet first dials. Now, if we can get really close, because I know our friends online are struggling to see what I can see here. But you can see that the red subscript...
He said move back a little bit.
Okay, that's as far as I can go. Do we have manual focus? Okay.
There we go.
So there we go. So now the red is very vivid because the 2s and the 4s both had red on white print, so it looked a little bit brighter on the Mark 2s and the Mark 4 dials. The first 3 were meters first. Feet first, everything is 4 and after, but feet first with non-aligned slashes about the F and the T, that's a Mark 4. Because for the 5, you would see alignment of the F and the T slashes, and then if you want to see a 6, you'll see closed 6s. That's a Mark 6. When you see closed 6s and feet first, that's a Mark 6. But what really sets this apart isn't what generation of red sub it is. It's the fact that it is wonderfully intact. Even the hands could plausibly be original to this watch. The only piece of luminova on this watch is the pearl of the bezel. So full disclosure, it has a wonderfully crisp service plexiglass, and look at that box section plexiglass, and it has a service bezel. Everything about the dial looks honest, original, and even, and significantly, because of the way these things were often treated, even in the 1680 generation, there is no water damage or moisture damage inside this watch. It also has most of its original metal. You can see the lugs at 6 o'clock have lost a little bit of volume, but you can even see a bit of the original factory beveling on these lugs, which is quite impressive for a watch that came about when Nixon was in office. That's a gorgeous red sub Mark IV.
Yeah, and you know what I think is great, especially about vintage Rolex, is that there's really no end to these. It's just as you had given the story about your grandmother's drawer, is that there's tons of drawers out there that have watches like this that are still consistently coming out, because this was not a limited edition of 400 pieces that are slowly coming out over time. This was a huge percentage of their yearly production now, slowly coming out and making its way into the light. And that's why every year new watches are discovered, new watches come out. There was just the Submariner with the Explorer dial that brought $1 million, dollars at auction.
Yeah, the one without a bezel.
And what's crazy about that is that that's probably just a rare watch that the guy walked into the store and bought the watch at the time, and it was there. And what's crazy is that back then, like, the Paul Newman dial. So the Paul Newman dial was not an in-demand watch. This was a watch that was generally not readily stocked and had to be special ordered from the factory.
It was considered to be a bad version of an already undesirable watch, the manual wind to Daytona in its day.
Correct. And what would happen is that consumers were always educated to buy what was there, because it was an arduous process in order to special order a watch from the factory. It was all, nothing was sent electronically. This was a hand-filled out order form, had to be sent to the factory. Then it had to be shipped, into the United States. So It was a long process, and your normal watch consumer just wanted to walk in and be able to buy a watch and leave. So, the individuals that purchased these watches very often purchased them overseas when they were traveling because that's where they were. And if you wanted to purchase one here, it was a special order more often than not. So, and that's why these rarer watches that you don't see as much is because at the time, nobody really wanted them.
The other thing I'll say is that we have this myth in the United States of the Corvette Stingray in the garage, and in England you have a similar expression, the Spitfire in the barn, the idea that during the Battle of Britain, Spitfires were hid in rural barns to keep them safe and, so they wouldn't get caught on the ground by the Blitz and they'd be able to get airborne to fight the bombers. But the idea is always that some of these might have been forgotten, and years later someone opens up his grandma's barn and finds a Spitfire still stationed. You're a lot more likely to find an old watch. So I would say this is the legend that sometimes becomes reality and sometimes comes to life. And don't just think about old, big crown and small crown subs. Vintage is an advancing threshold. When I talked about 20-year-old watches, that coincides exactly with the end of tritium dial Rolex. You look at a Rolex in 1998 with a stamped clasp and a tritium dial and a Daytona with the zenith movement, it was a different world. So someday we're going to talk about finding 1980s subs in the junk drawer and people getting rich selling those at auctions.
That'll be crazy.
Vintage is an advancing front. And speaking of which, why don't we jump? We did the
We just did
we did the
Rolexes.
30s, we did the 50s, we did the early 70s. Why don't we do the 70s?
Perfect. So here we have a
followed.
Breitling Sprint. So most of you probably have no idea what this watch is. And this is a watch that was produced by Willy Breitling. It's the Breitling Sprint. It is a resin case. So this was a watch that was produced for athletes. And Willy Breitling was very often ahead of his time, and he probably doesn't get enough credit. But he was a big believer that there was going to be a major movement into health and consumers wanting to be outdoors and being active. And this was well before that even happened. And, he figured that if that was the case and all of these consumers were going to be more active, they were going to need light watches. So he came out with this, I guess I don't want to call it inexpensive because at the time it was probably not that inexpensive, but a sports watch made out of resin that's incredibly light for, the athlete of the time. And this was a watch that I don't think that did that well when it was originally produced.
No, it didn't. This was kind of a Volks chrono back in its day. It was made to be exceptionally cheap, and there were actually two series of Breitlings made to try to exploit the entry-level sporting market, the active lifestyle crowd of its day. Some of them were chrome-plated brass cases, and when I saw this come in, I'm like, please don't let it be one of those. And I realized then this is actually the resin case. So these came about in 1972. They feature a Valjoux 7733 manual wind chrono. You can see it's got a 45-minute register because that's all you really need for local activities. Gorgeous combination of colors on the dial, completely unmolested. This one's one of those junk drawer watches from Grandma's house. You can see the reference and even the retail price on the case back. I'll also say this watch was ahead of its time in more ways than one. Anticipating the active lifestyle crowd, yes, but also the forefather of bright light. If you remember that material that debuted at Baselworld 2018, basically the plastic Breitling Hurricanes and Sky Racers, well, you know what? This was the forefather of that back in 1972, and these were made just about up to the end of Breitling family control in 1978. It's not uncommon to find them. It is uncommon to find one in museum quality, so this watch is unusual in that respect. It's also just objectively redolent of 70s design, so it works on a couple of levels. If you're into vintage Breitling, you need to give it a consideration.
And you got to show the sticker on the back.
Also note, for you joggers, cyclists, and swimmers, a pulsation scale, not a tachymeter.
And right on the back there, we have the original tag that showed the sticker price of $190 at the time, which, I mean, again, the calfskin strap that was put on this watch is $190 now.
Yeah, a gorgeous piece, and what a throwback. Plus, it's got undeniable vintage charm, and the vultures haven't hit this market yet. 70s Breitling is still not just not hot, it's not even lukewarm. If you're into watches for the sake of the watches and the history, get into this segment now before people start speculating. Buy an honest watch and enjoy it for its own sake. Don't worry about getting rich, just worry about having fun. And this watch is a great example of how you can still do that with major brand vintage, but again, that window is closing.
I love that piece.
Awesome watch. What else do we have here?
Well, we've got a
Let's you want to do the Heuer first, or should we do the Rolex first?
Let's stick with the 70s,
Fine.
since this 5.4 million serial GMT is still very squarely in the mid to late 70s.
So here we have a 1675 root beer featuring a brown nipple dial, yellow gold case, yellow gold Jubilee bracelet, and it's just absolutely magnificent. I mean, this to me is my favorite watch on the table.
A couple of things set this one apart. Well, first of all, the condition. A gorgeous root beer style dial, and you can see how it's not fair to call this a root beer bezel, root beer dial, because even though the lights of the studio do lie a bit, I can confirm that in person it looks more like burgundy. And the nipple dial was an upscale applique dial that set the gold and richest of the GMTs apart from the rest. The GMT was always a premium model. From the time the very first ones debuted in the 6542 generation, they were all chronometer certified. They were all available in gold. They always had a date. They were never entry-level watches. But this is a different level of luxury, not just for the upscale pilot's profession. This is for the accomplished man who might be a traveler and has taken a fancy to the pilot's watch. Now, the format may be pilot, but this is a patrician. This was the Rolex take on luxury watches before Rolex became a luxury watch company. As back in roughly 1976, when this watch would have been made, Rolex was not yet the standard bearer for status around the office. So it took someone with a truly independent inspiration to go out and seek a luxury version of a tool watch for daily use. Great for travel, handsome, distinctive with the appliques rather than the printed dial. This and the Concorde hands are the truly special GMTs from the 60s and the 70s. A gorgeous piece and wonderfully full. As you can see, the original lugs have survived almost completely intact on both sides. Nice and even across with the beveling still complete, and a dial that's absolutely antiseptic.
And I love the fact that you can take this bracelet off and put it on a strap as well, and it completely changes the look of the watch. And as you had mentioned, the dial almost has like a rich maroon color as it aged over time. And I think that the aging and the patinaing of the watch is a very important process, and it's a big factor in how the ultimate value of the watch is determined.
Yeah, it does have almost a rich red wine quality to that dial. That's a wonderful watch for someone who wants to get into vintage Rolex and doesn't want the one that everyone else has, because vintage Rolex on the steel side is well established. You don't see a huge movement behind gold Rolex that's not like a 6062 or a Baodai Emperor of Thailand type thing. Especially with older gold Rolex sports watches, we're just starting to see that market develop. And although the Daytonas are all crazy in every metal, outside the Daytona hysteria chamber, there's still a good buy to be had in precious metal vintage Rolex.
Any questions from that, guys? Feel free. I don't see many questions from the chat, so if you guys have any questions.
We got one, and the answer is no. Do we have any Paul Newmans in the vault?
No, the answer is no. JBO Surf, what year is the root beer?
The root beer is roughly 1976.
Guys, keep them coming. Why don't we move to the last watch on the table? And if you guys have any other questions, we'll answer them as they come. So here we have a Heuer Skipper watch. This is the last iteration of the Skipper. Right after Jack Heuer left the company and right before, it became Tag Heuer. So the Skipper watch, as many of you, if you weren't aware of the watch before Hodinkee came out with their iteration of it, was a regatta timing watch that was really Heuer's boating watch. They had their racing watch, they had their flying watch, and this was the boating watch. And, stylistically, I want to say, I think, Tim, you had said there were 7 generations of the watch?
Yeah, there were roughly 7 generations of Skipper. This one is a 11063 stamped case, but it's actually a reference, I believe, 15640. So this would have been a 15640, I believe, fourth execution. A couple things set this thing apart. First, it's very much a refugee from the 70s. By 1985, Heuer, following the Piaget-Le Mans takeover, was not in great shape. It was an attractive takeover target for technique d'avant-garde. And of course, TAG later became one half of the brand. This was one of the last pure Heuers that wasn't some sort of a re-edition Heuer dial. So from 1983 to 1985, this model was made, and it used the holdover from the late 60s, known as the Caliber 15. Based on the original Caliber 11, Caliber 15 debuted during the 70s, roughly 1972, and continued until the mid-80s. It was something of a stripped-down Caliber 11 micro rotor, which of course was a Buren-based micro rotor with the Dubois de Praz 8000 series module. It was part of the original family of automatic chronographs, but by 1985, it was getting a little long in the tooth. This one was modified for regatta use, as the 30-minute minute register was actually converted in this iteration to a 15-minute tri-register. So you have 3 groups of 5 minutes, a modification of the basic modular Caliber 15 chronograph, a beautifully untouched tritium dial and matching tritium pearl in the unidirectional bezel. These were at the time 100 meters water resistant, and with the unidirectional bezel, they were really all-purpose aquatic sports watches. You could use them for regatta, you could use them for swimming, even light-duty diving thanks to the water resistance rating. Now this one is wonderfully intact. As you can see, the original knurled chronograph pushers are still present and correct. The original Heuer signed crown is still present and correct. The bevels of the case are razor sharp. You can even see that the sunray finish of the hoods of the lugs, a very 70s type style, inspired by the Heuer sports watches of that period and held over to the first half of the 80s, still intact and correct. That sunray radial graining, often the first thing that goes when watches from this era age and get refinished. Even the bracelet is intact, and it features a Heuer signed clasp that's still wonderfully full and crisp when operated. Yes, it's a little bit of a Rolex Jubilee knockoff, but you know what? It works and it's comfortable and it looks the business. A period bracelet on a very period piece, and this dial, absolutely spotless, as good as it gets in vintage. If you're worried about the vintage snake pit, rest assured, I've been all over this one. This is as good as it gets, no questions asked. And practically perfect.
You know, one of the, I'd say, key differentiating factors about us, because I got to give ourselves a plug, is, you know, we traditionally deal directly with the consumer. So most of the watches that you see that we have that are, you know, that are here on the table or that are presented on our website, you know, we're buying, selling, and trading from your watch consumer and then selling, you know, to your watch consumer. A lot of the other vintage watches that you see out in the marketplace is very dealer to dealer, which is how watches can get, I would say, Frankensteined or changed over time. Many of the watches that you see here are honestly, you know, the original owners, second generation owners, and, you know, individuals that have had the watch for an extraordinarily long period of time or just trading them in for something else.
That's a fact. Every watch on this table is a good representative of its type. I wouldn't hesitate to buy any of these watches myself. On the vintage scene, I've only ever gone vintage once.
And you're anal when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I will loop these dials to death before I represent them in my videos, because I don't want to go and do a watch showcase of something that I can't vouch for. There have been watches in the past that I had not had a chance to evaluate yet, and I didn't shoot the video until I had time to spend 15 minutes going over a case and dial. So we're proud of the fact that we bring in good stuff and we represent it accurately and with integrity.
Yeah. So, any other questions from the chat?
Yeah, people ask me, what do I think about the vintage Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, the Owl? He has one from the 80s.
I have no idea what that even is.
That is a...
I'm going to look it up here while you're talking.
That is a twin register Audemars Piguet Royal Oak calendar watch from, I want to say the first ones came out in about 1983-84. I would say collectability of any mid-size Royal Oak case is always going to be so-so. I always think that for whatever reason, the mid-size watches are not properly respected, and again, there's the 5402 from that era, and there's everything else. Even the perpetuals. And
Oh, I know that watch. I just didn't know the nickname.
yeah, even the perpetuals, which started in 1981, are not as well respected as the 5402s. So I think you buy that watch because it's beautiful, and if you're interested in collecting, buy one that is razor sharp with no refinishing, because you got to give yourself every chance to get ahead when buying a watch that's a little bit underrated on the vintage scene, and the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak vintage movement has sort of passed those by. I think you buy them to enjoy them. They're not investment pieces yet, but that could change. I never thought we'd see a Paul Newman Daytona go from like a $15,000 watch in 1999 to minimally 10 times that in the year 2018. Things change, and sometimes people go crazy.
Yeah, and that particular watch I think is an example of a piece that has appreciated in value over the last few years, as Royal Oaks in general have appreciated. Because as you've seen the steady climb of where 15400s and 15300s are climbing to, and the 39 chronos and so on and so forth, this is a watch that has risen as a result of the prices of those increasing. And I think it's a great watch. I think that it's a interesting dial layout. You've got a day-date complication there, which is actually more complicated than their time-only 15400. And I think that this is a watch that you can actually still get at a reasonably good price. I don't necessarily think that the values of those are going to skyrocket anytime soon, but I do think that as Audemars starts selling more through their own channel and becomes less available in the secondary, less available at a discount anywhere, that the secondary market of their watches will rise, and this will continue to rise with it. My particular favorite example of that watch is the black dial variation.
I'll also say the late 90s Royal Oak mid-size annual calendar is a cool piece. They made very few of them. Get one in steel with a blue dial. That's a fun piece to own if you want a calendar complication Royal Oak. Okay, so we had a question from Jordan Kramer. Can you wish my cousin Mark a happy birthday? Mark, have a very happy birthday. Wear your watches in the best of health. Enjoy the week and the weekend to come. All right. And a question from Kevin K. Is the Jaeger-Lecoultre Reverser Platinum Tourbillon worth it now that prices have dropped? Yeah, prices have dropped. $126,000 would have bought you one of these back in 2003. And if we're talking about the watch that I have, about $30,000 to $40,000 will buy it today. Why? Principally because it's an obscure model from a company that right now is trying to fight past image problems, and it's a small timepiece with a tourbillon on the case back. And the tourbillon watch as a type generally appeals to the guy who wants to show it off on a big platform rather than hide it discreetly. So for a bunch of reasons, that's a great buy if you can find one.
Yeah, I think that if that's a watch that I think that if you can buy one at the right price, it's worth buying. I wouldn't say that it's like an investment grade watch, but I think that it's a watch that you can get a lot of watch for the money.
Yeah, you can get a ton of watch. It's got a white gold movement, a platinum case that's hand engraved, a hand painted dial made of solid gold, ruthenium coated. That's
you have that watch, don't you?
I do own that watch.
You own that watch. You single-handedly brought up the value of that watch.
I'm doing my part. And I'm not selling either, so I'm never going to cash in. Question coming from Matthew Devine. First watch, $2,000 to $3,000 is his budget, and he's a fan of the show. Matthew, we have some suggestions. Brian, $2,000 to $3,000 to spend. What would you recommend?
I mean, I really think it depends on the overall look and aesthetic that you're going for. I mean, I think $2,000 to $3,000. I think that you can get a great Oris Diver 65 for that amount. That I want to say they retail for $2,000. I think that you can get on the upper end of that budget, you're going to be looking at a Tudor Black Bay. I think that offers you a great option. You get a lot of watch for the money. What else? I mean, I would say, you have pretty much the bulk of Tag Heuer at your disposal at that point. You've got Oris, you've got Tudor, you've got Nomos. Nomos produces a lot of great watches at that price point. So I really think it depends. That's a price point that a lot of companies have gotten into, and the watches at that price point have gotten leaps and bounds better over the last several years. So I think that it really just depends on the aesthetic that you're going for, and really take it from there.
Generation 2 Omega X33 on a bracelet. I have other suggestions, of course. Oris Big Crown Pointer Date.
That's a good one.
Steel, green dial, the D26 HB RAG limited edition. I would also recommend you look for a pre-owned Nomos Ahoy Atlantic Blau. That's an awesome buy and an awesome watch, and an all-purpose watch too.
Where's he going to find a pre-owned Ahoy Atlantic Blau? You know what the chances of that are?
We might have one.
Do we have one?
Every once in a while we do.
Okay, take a look.
And I would also say you want to keep your mind open and consider just about everything that's available. For $3,000 you can get a serious watch. You might even be able to buy my old Omega Seamaster Bond. So if you want to go back about 2 decades, I'm not selling mine, it's my graduation watch. But that's an all-timer that's already stood the test of time, 25 years young this year. Or go back a little farther and buy yourself the Seamaster 200, the pre-Bond. That's a real speculative collectible that might actually have a short-term payoff. Check out the pre-Bond Seamaster 200. Also, check out the Girard Perrigo 7000 Traveler from the 80s. You can still pick those up, ETA-powered and gloriously, beautifully proportioned, old-school Girard Perrigo style from the 80s with a travel complication for under $3,000. You can still pick those up, and I recommend it.
And also from the chat, actually, great choice, Timekeeper. The new Black Bay 58 is also a great option. The watch is brand new.
Can you get that for $3,000?
I think so, can't you?
Give it 12 months. I would also say consider, if you can, one of the ETA-powered Pelagos models, because the Pelagos is hugely underrated. And if you can't get into a Pelagos for $3,000, I think you can pre-owned. I would also say consider the Hydronaut 2 from the 2000s, the lost era of Tudor dive watches.
So, unfortunately, that is all that we have for tonight, guys. We are getting the cue that the show must end. So, join us next week for another great show of The Watch Insider. My name is Brian.
I'm Tim.
And thank you guys for logging on.